Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. We're going to continue now and expand upon our factoring review from the previous video. In this video, we're going to solve quadratics by factoring. And what that means is we are going to take factoring and we're just going to add one or two steps to it in order to find the solutions or the x-intercepts of a quadratic. And the way we're going to do that is called the zero product property. And I don't really expect you to remember that name but I want you to know how to use it. A zero product property, product multiplication. So if two things multiply together to give you zero, like 7x equals 0, 2.87x equals 0, this last equation, which simplifies to 3x equals 0, if we have something like that, okay, what would x have to be in each of these cases if we solve these? Well, x would have to equal 0 because we know anything times 0 is going to equal 0. So the zero product property basically says if you have two or more numbers that multiply together to equal 0, one of those numbers or both of them have to be 0. So if AB equals 0, then either A equals 0, B equals 0, or they both equal 0. Okay? So how does that really tie into factoring? You'll find out in 1 second. Okay? So it'll be a little easier once we have an example. But some notes first. We use this method when the quadratic has an x term. What I mean by that is remember your standard form for a quadratic. If it has an x term and is easily factorable. Okay, if it can easily be factored. So a couple ground rules, and this stuff's bolded because it's super important. A quadratic must be set equal to 0. Because that's the whole idea of the zero product property, is that you have multiple things that multiply together to equal 0. Okay, another little hint or a help, make sure your a value is positive. Okay, we don't want an a value to be negative, which means we would have to factor out a GCF of negative. Just make your life a little bit easier and always make sure that your a value is positive. Okay, and then after it's set equal to 0, try to factor it. Look for a GCF, guess and check. Okay, and then once it's factored, here is our new step. We're going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. Okay? So this skill is super important. This, along with factoring, you're going to do in every math class from here on out. All right? Factoring is super important at this upper level math. So solve each quadratic by factoring. Notice in A, this is already factored for us. So all we need to do is do our new step, because b minus 7 times 3b plus 4, that equals 0. So we have two things that are multiplying together, b minus 7 and 3b plus 4. And when they multiply together, they equal 0, which means one of them has to be 0. So we need to solve for the values of b that are going to make each expression become 0. And the way we do that is we break this off and we set each factor equal to 0. B minus 7 equals 0. If I solve that, I get b equals 7. And then 3b plus 4 equals 0. This one's a two-step equation. But when I solve that, I'm going to get b equals negative 4/3. Those are the values of b that if I plug them back in is going to make a factor become 0, so that when it multiplies the other factor, you get out a product of 0. Okay? And remember, solutions are x-intercepts. So if I were to look at a graph of a quadratic here, I would have an x-intercept at 7 and an x-intercept at negative 4/3. Okay? And then this quadratic would look something like that. It's referring to the x-intercepts. We're just doing it without having to graph and use our calculator. We're being a little bit smarter and a little bit faster with solving these quadratics. Okay? What about B? Well, first red flag that you should see is that it's not set equal to 0. So that's the first thing we're going to do is subtract 10c from both sides. So c squared minus 10c equals 0. Next step in factoring is to look for a GCF. So what do c squared and 10c have in common? I can factor out a c, and I'm going to be left with c minus 10. Okay? Now from there, I can break this off and set each factor equal to 0. Well, with our first factor, that's already done. C's by itself. C equals 0. And then in our second factor, when we solve this one-step equation, we get C to be 10. Those were our two solutions, our x-intercepts, our roots, our zeros. Okay, now it maybe makes a little bit more sense on why x-intercepts are also called 0 is because we have to set it equal to 0. And that's how we get our solution. Okay, let's go on to our next one. Y squared plus 5y minus 24. Now this one's set equal to 0, but we got a little bit more work now because we have to factor it. So there's no GCF. The first two terms need to multiply to give me y squared, so that's going to be y and y. The last two terms need to multiply to give me 24, so we're looking at 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 4 and 6, 3 and 8. Okay? So hopefully we're getting a little bit speedy with our factoring. Okay, two numbers, they got to multiply to negative 24. Our inners and our outers need to add to give me 5y. Well, hopefully you see that that's going to be y plus 8 and y minus 3. But there's a new thing now. It's an equation. So we factored the expression, but since it's an equation, I need to keep it an equation. So this has to say equals 0. Y plus 8 times y minus 3 equals 0. From here, we split off each of our factors and we set them equal to 0. So I'm looking at y equals negative 8 and y equals 3. Those are our two solutions for this quadratic. Okay, factor it, set it equal to 0, and then the only new step is to break off each factor and set it equal to 0. All right, last one. We do not have it set equal to 0 yet, so that's our first step. So we'll have 2x squared minus x minus 28 equals 0. Now, no GCF, so we need to break it off. Our first two terms need to multiply to give me 2x squared, so that's going to be 2x and x. Don't forget to set it equal to 0. It's still an equation. Now, our last two terms need to multiply to give me 28, and the inners and the outers need to combine to give me negative 1x. So 28, we're looking at 1 and 28, 2 and 14, 4 and 7. After guess and check, we can figure out that this is going to look like 2x plus 7 and x minus 4. Because our inners and our outers, the only way that those can give me negative 1x is if that's negative 8x and positive 7x. So from there, to finish this out, because all we've done right now is factor it, to solve this equation, to actually figure out what x equals, I'm going to split each of my factors off and set them equal to 0. So 2x plus 7 equals 0. X is going to equal negative 7 halves, or negative 3.5. And then x minus 4 equals 0. X is going to equal 4. Okay? So that is how we solve by factoring. There's one additional thing I want to talk about, because there's not a problem in your notes like it, but it might show up on your homework. Let's go back to C. Let's say it's the same exact equation, but it has a GCF of 2. So we have 2y squared plus 10y minus 48 equals 0. What do we do to get rid of the GCF? Well, we factor like normal. So we have 2 times y squared plus 5y minus 24 equals 0. But how do I get rid of that 2? Well, notice how 2 is multiplying y squared plus 5y minus 24. And we want to get y squared plus 5y minus 24 by itself. Well, since 2 is just a constant, 2 is just a number, I can divide both sides by 2. That's going to cancel out the 2 on the left-hand side and leave me just with y squared plus 5y minus 24. And on the right-hand side, 0 divided by a number, 0 divided by anything other than 0, 0 divided by 2, for instance, is just going to equal 0. And then we are left with what the problem is originally in C. So if your GCF is just a number, it doesn't contain a variable, you can break that apart, okay? Factor out the GCF and then divide both sides by that to get the quadratic by itself. Okay, I'm going to stop the video here just to give your mind a little break. And then in the next video, I will cover example 2, which are a little bit more problem-solving type questions. So make sure you study these, okay? There will be some of the You Try Now questions are going to be a Schoology quiz, and the other ones will probably pop up on your homework. Alrighty? So that's going to wrap up this video. Pay attention to the next one to finish up the notes.